Jeff Rathke. He's the director of the Office of Press Relations at the State Department. He has been in this job since 1991, and before that served in a variety of political and diplomatic posts in Berlin, Moscow, Dublin. Am I missing any place? Oh, Kuala Lumpur, most recently.
Most recently, yes.
So he's been all over, and now he's back in the U.S. Now, typically, as you know, everything that we do at the National Press Foundation is on the record, and Jeff has asked, actually he's sort of given us a choice, right? We can go on the record today, and he can go through his slides in the most straightforward way, or if you guys are willing, and everyone in the room would have to be willing to go off the record, he may be able to give you information that's more interesting, maybe even more useful. Am I characterizing that correctly?
I would say anecdotes that are more colorful is the way I would put it.
Okay, so, and actually not off the record, but on background.
Yeah.
Right, so you can use this information, but can't quote him if that's okay. So let's take a vote. Let's let everyone who is in favor of making this session on background, please raise your hand. All right, Mark, you're out. Who else? We got a couple people out. In that case, we're going to have to go on the record.
That's fine.
Because I'm not going to kick any journalists actually out of the room.
Of course. No, that's fine.
So that's what we'll do. If there's any particular part of your presentation that you want to, ask them again, that's up to you.
Okay.
But so we'll be on the record.
Okay, that's great.
Okay.
Well,
thank
you very much, Linda, for the opportunity to come here and talk with you today. And I know this is the last bit of the day. Is this the end of the whole
No, this is not the end of the
fellowship?
They've got
No.
several months to go.
Okay.
But you are the end of the day.
Okay, so not wanting to be too stodgy and boring at the end of the day, maybe I'll want to get a little sense for what is most interesting to you, if I could, at the start. First, as Linda mentioned, I've been working for the State Department for a couple of decades. Actually, I'm not a press officer by background. I'm actually a political officer. So I've spent most of my time in jobs where I've constantly got people telling me that I shouldn't be talking to folks like you, or I should only be talking to folks like you if somebody else has cleared it first. So now that I'm director of the press office, it puts me on the other side of that equation, which I think is a really eye-opening sort of job, because I've always, I guess, appreciated, but never really fully grasped how dependent we are on all of you in the media for us not to be a tree falling in the forest. Now, of course, we have our own platforms, and we can push stories out, and we can try to convey messages that we consider important. But still, despite all of those opportunities, the things that you do reach far greater populations and interested groups. So we realize that we're only doing our job well if we're able to help you do many of the things that you're interested in doing. Maybe I would also start off by asking, how many of you have had to deal with the State Department up to now in this or current or previous guises? Anybody want to offer whether it was a positive or a negative experience, or what it was about, or anything else?
I've had both.
Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, in the sense that, sometimes it's been smooth and I've been able to get everything they want, and then other times it's someone being like, oh yeah, we met at a conference, and I'm like, oh, I'm just really interested in talking about anything, and they're like, oh, and let me introduce you to my press person, and the door kind of just closes, so.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But
okay. Others?
So I cover cybersecurity. So
okay.
Sort of
all right. Good. Others who've interacted with state? There were a few hands. Now they've disappeared.
I've basically only talked to the duty people on the weekends because I'm the person on duty on the weekends.
Okay.
And they are very friendly about being bothered on the weekends, which I appreciate. They don't normally give me as much information as I want, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it different on weekdays?
I actually don't know because I haven't had that experience yet.
Okay. I think, did you have your hand up?
I work on the Latin America desk for AP Television, and for anything out of Latin America, for the briefings, the Cuba-U.S. deal, we dealt a lot with some press people at the State Department. It was an okay experience.
Okay. All right. This is also your opportunity to tell me things I should know if I need to, follow up on any of it. So if any other experiences occur to you that you want to mention, at any time or afterwards, feel free. So the press office and the State Department, as maybe not one of the largest, but still as a large organization, we are broken down into a main press function, which is in our Bureau of Public Affairs. That's what I'm part of. So we are responsible for the daily press briefing. Sometimes when the spokesperson and deputy spokesperson are traveling, I do the daily press briefing, but normally it's those two ladies, Jen Psaki and Marie Harf, who conduct the briefing. We are also responsible for the people who are on duty evenings and weekends, who take incoming queries, try to get you answers, either based on guidance that we're prepared for, or if it's something new, then to track down people who can provide us some insights that we can pass back. We are responsible for the Secretary's media events. So if he does an event inside the State Department building that is open to the press, then we are responsible for managing that. And then we do a few other things like the transcription, and we monitor the media. So if stories happen, we can inform senior leadership. So that's our function. But then in each of the bureaus, and I think you alluded to this also, Tal, is that each of the big bureaus has their own press people. So we try to work in coordination with them. Sometimes they have much deeper subject matter expertise, and they'll take the lead on answering a query. Other times, they'll simply keep us updated so we can deal with a larger mass of queries. Anyway, we work with them, and try to avoid any kind of anything falling through the cracks where we think our Western Hemisphere colleagues are going to answer you, and they think we're doing it, and that we drop it. So, at any rate, that's the way we are set up. As far as the these sort of nuts and bolts, that's what I've just mentioned. The centerpiece of what we do is the daily press briefing, and it's the opportunity for us to reach the largest potential audience. The State Department press corps. We generally have about two dozen or so people in the room. A lot of people are live tweeting what is being said in the press briefing. So that's the centerpiece of our day. We spend a couple of hours preparing for the briefing with the spokesperson, and then usually a couple of hours following up any questions that might be taken, and because we weren't able to answer them on the spot. So that's a system that has been in existence for a long time. We try to get back the same day to any questions we take. There are rare instances where that proves not to be possible, but in general, we strive either to get an answer in the briefing or in the remainder of the day. So I think for most of you, this is not the way you would interact with us, though, unless you happen to be watching the briefing or referring to the transcript. Yes?
When you say credentialed journalists, like on the Hill, you need to have a Hill pass. Do you need to bring your credentials?
So if you have a credential from your organization, from an acknowledged news organization, and you show up at the State Department for the press briefing, we'll let you in. You come into the briefing room. You ask whatever questions you want. There are some people who are in the State Department press corps who are regular attendees of the briefing, and they will get a State Department pass, which allows them access to certain parts of the building, so they don't have to go through that rigmarole. But that tends to be, for most organizations, one or two people who are permanently assigned, more or less, to state. So that's how we try to take care of most most
is that possible, like for television as well? Is there a pool setting, or if you're a credentialed member of the television media, can you bring a photographer?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. I mean, for that it takes clearing equipment takes a little bit more time. Right. But yeah, it's no problem. There is a pool arrangement, so the networks take turns providing a pool feed. We also provide our own feed and audio, so anyone can make use of that. Or if you wanted to bring your own camera or a still photographer, yeah, it's certainly doable. So that's again that's how we transact a lot of our business. Now, after hours, we have a duty officer all the time. So if there's ever a query that comes up, anytime, day or night, you can send it to this email address. The phone number there is during regular business hours. But the way we operate is we get a query through this email distribution. You should get an acknowledgement from the duty officer that they've received it, and if they have the information on hand, then they'll get right back to you. If not, it may take a little bit more time. So this system works pretty well. We had a little email trouble a couple of weeks ago that got in the way of it. But basically, this is how we handle most of the after hours queries. If you send something at 3 a.m. to the press duty officer, you won't necessarily get an immediate response. Duty officer's got to sleep too. So if there is something that is truly urgent, the number that's not up here, but is the State Department's Operations Center. And that number is 647-1512. And those, so that's a 24-hour operation center. They are not there primarily to support media inquiries, but if there is a truly urgent issue, then they can put you in touch with the press duty officer. They do that at their discretion, though. They'll make a judgment about whether this is something that warrants waking somebody up in the middle of the night for, or they may hold it until the morning. That's at their discretion. Yes.
And that was my question. Do y'all have press officers on call? Because things happen.
Right. So we do, and if something happens that requires immediate or more or less immediate attention, then yes, we haul the duty officer out of bed. He or she may get in touch either in Washington with the bureau that has the most expertise on that. Maybe it's a regional bureau, maybe it's a functional bureau like our counterterrorism bureau or our bureau that deals with refugee issues or human rights issues and so forth. They can also reach out to our embassies in the field to try to get greater perspective. So that's certainly possible. We do that in exceptional circumstances, not just because there's interest in a story and somebody happens to hit upon it at 3 a.m. But that's the responsibility of our duty officer. I'll come to the media requests in a second, but that's. I would say that that support that we provide, especially when there's truly breaking news, is a core part of our responsibility. So we certainly, whether it's a terrorist attack that happens somewhere on the other side of the world, or some other urgent development, we want to be able to take care of that, and we are staffed in order to do so. If you want to interview, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to ask that if you needed an on-camera interview, somebody to go on camera, how do we go about that?
Right. So that's the next thing. So if you want to do an interview on camera or for writers, then this is the way to lodge a request, media requests at state.gov, and then we will look at the request. We'll talk to the relevant official, and then we'll come back to you with an answer. Now, we get a lot of requests for interviews. I'll be honest with you, we are not able to meet every single request, and so that's this is the way to do it. Now, you may also, in the course of your time interacting with people at the State Department, you may have developed contacts in one of the bureaus that deals with a particular issue. You may know people who are subject matter experts. You are, of course, welcome to contact them too. Sometimes, if you have an ongoing relationship with the bureau, that may help. They'll say, "Oh yes, I know Emery, and we've dealt with her in the past, and we'd be happy to do it again." Sometimes those situations arise. So you're certainly welcome to be in direct contact. In general, though, any decision about doing an interview or not would be done in sort of a coordinated way. So But certainly, if a bureau is in favor of doing the interview, then they're willing to go out of their way to make it, to make the scheduling happen. So, very often the people you'll be interested in talking to are people whose time is simply limited, and so they don't do too much on the record. So anyway, this is the way to do that. Now, all of this information I've just been talking about, with the exception of the number for the Operations Center, I think you can all find on the State Department website, which is state.gov, and then there's a section on media and for the press. So you can find all of that information there in case it is not seared into your memory. But those are the basic nuts and bolts. I would maybe make a couple of additional observations, and that is, again, we do our best to be as responsive as we can to you. Naturally, there will sometimes be things we are not in a position to comment on, at least on the record. We will often try to give in response a combination of things that are perhaps on the record with some background, or perhaps off the record. And we certainly appreciate people's understanding for that. I don't know if any of your organizations have a restrictive approach or even a prohibition on taking things on background. Okay, one. If I could say, if that's your policy, helpful to let us know that. I'm not even sure which organization you're with. Okay, so I don't know if we've had too many inquiries from the Arkansas Democrat lately, but we have from some other organizations where they haven't told us that they will not take something on background, and then we give them something on background, and then it gets kind of messy. If you have any requirements, editorial or otherwise as far as sourcing, then helpful for us to know that. I'd say also we try to be as flexible as we can within the constraints that are placed on us. As I say, there are sometimes things we're not able to say much about on the record. Our press officers will often go out of their way to try to give you something on background or off the record, at least for context, whether it's to help get an editor off your back or simply to give you an orientation of how what we see happening. A lot of that depends, though, on building the rapport with each of you. So the better that is, I think the easier it is for them to work to give you as much as possible. I think that's all I would say in terms of introductory remarks. If there are aspects of that you'd like to hear more about, whether they're technical or otherwise, that's great. Or if you have questions about particular policy issues, happy to get into that as well. I'd really sort of leave it up to you to say what you would find most interesting, and have a little bit more dialogue then. Tal already spoke up once, but we'll go to you and then we'll come to Mark.
So
sorry.
I was going to ask, sort of before we dive into asking you about policy issues.
Yep.
What resources you might have for journalists, if we're covering a part of what we're not familiar with, that kind of thing. If it's not a direct, we need an answer on this, but how can we use the State Department in our everyday reporting, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so if you're looking for really basic information, a lot of that you find on the State Department website. You also can find a lot of it if you go to the CIA World Factbook. You can find a lot of that stuff. I'm not sure if that's what you really have in mind, or if you're looking for somebody who can just sort of, hey, can somebody talk to me for 5 minutes about country X? Those are things, again, that we can try to do. We don't. It's always a bit of a balance between, on the one hand, trying to be responsive. On the other hand, I'll be honest, if we get questions that are background questions that we think a journalist can find out on his or her own, we will let you do that, and we'll try to preserve people's time for interacting on things that have more to do with U.S. policy rather than things that aren't in our purview. So.
What about embassies? Like if there's something happening.
In general, embassies should have the flexibility to talk to journalists. Anything that would be, on the record, or even on background, they would probably come back to us and say, "Hey, we've been approached by outlet X. Do you have any objection if we do this?" So, we try to do that in a way that's helpful and is not sort of shutting down channels of communication, but simply so that people understand what interest there is out there, and that if the same outlet approaches multiple parts of the State Department, that we give an answer that's consistent and that doesn't raise additional questions. That's the other thing. I mean, we have an inherent desire in consistency of message. So we need to keep coordinated with people in the field as well as people across the department. Mark.
This is more of a media strategy question. And let me say right off the bat, coming from broadcast, I very, 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 very much appreciate that you have daily, for the most part, daily on-the-record briefings. On the media strategy question, so you oversee the press office, so Jen Psaki, Marie Harf, anybody who's going to brief the media, right?
Well, I don't oversee them. It's the other way around. They oversee me. So the I report to Jen Psaki. And she is responsible not only for the operations of the press office, but things having to do with the secretary's travel and other kinds of sort of messaging that doesn't go through traditional media, but that does so on behalf of the secretary. So we in my office deal primarily with the domestic media, to a degree with the international media, but then new media, our digital engagement and so forth is handled by other people. But anyway, just to...
Got it.
Yeah.
So my question was going to be, on the media strategy, both Jen and Marie have very, very different styles when it comes to that briefing. Jen seems very calm and she's very even tone. Marie seems as though she comes off sometimes as rather abrasive when she's answering people's questions. And I just wonder, is there thought given to the tone that's set at those daily briefings? Is that something you folks have talked about?
Well, the spokesperson and the deputy spokesperson, again, they report to in terms of the message that they convey, they report to the secretary and to his senior team. So that's certainly not my place to critique their performance. I don't really have
They're
a
just
whole lot
very
to
different
add.
at the briefing podium.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't see your name from all the way back here. So, Elvina. Elvina? Oh, I can't even read it. Now there's reflection. Nawaguna?
I said that fast, but I'll give you a pass for that. Elvina Nawaguna, you're right.
Yes.
Now I forget my question.
Ah, good.
I remember. So I imagine a lot of the questions received, or a lot of the coverage is reactive to some kind of major event. But are there some issues that happen within the State Department, some stories that don't ever get, that we never cover, that journalists never pay attention to that
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, there are a lot of things that the State Department does of which we are proud, and we wish people had more interest in them. That happens sometimes, but you're right. A lot of what we do is reactive. Something happens, people are interested in it, they ask us questions. The daily press briefing generally lasts about an hour, and in that hour, there's only a limited number of things you can talk about, and in general, the structure of the daily press briefing is we are responding to questions. So it's really driven, that agenda is driven by you or your colleagues from your organizations who come to the briefing. Now, sometimes if we want to be sure that an issue is at least in the transcript and on the record, so anybody in the public knows what our view is, then we may read it out at the top of the briefing. every day there's probably one or two things that we'll talk about. Today, for example, actually we had quite a few today. Today there was a bit about the Secretary's travel, which I think people would have asked about anyway. We talked about the release, the completion of the release of the 53 Cuban political prisoners, about which we had, of the list that we had presented to the Cuban authorities. We talked about the 5th anniversary of the Haiti earthquake and the political developments over the weekend in Haiti, which was a good thing because actually no one asked about it. And so, in that case, no one would have that wouldn't be on the record anywhere. That's let me see, what were the other two? Two additional things we talked about at the top. Oh, one was travel by General Allen in the Middle East, which we didn't get questions about, but it was good for us to at least have had the opportunity to say that he's out there and what he's up to. So, that's just one small example of the ways we try to at least flag that there are these other stories. And then if there is a story that perhaps is more of is not a fleeting bit of daily news, but that we think a particular organization might have interest, we may approach them and say, hey, you cover arms control. Here's this story that we'd like to talk more about. Are you interested? And if there's interest, then we may do an interview and provide, materials for background. But if not, then we're really, in a way, at your mercy. Yes?
Has the timeline for the State Department approving or rejecting the Keystone Pipeline changed given the recent Nebraska ruling? And also, how much input at this point does Secretary Kerry have in the President's final decision on this project?
Well, so with respect to the process for Keystone, there are a couple of different things that feed into it. There is, on the one hand, there was a public comment. There was a supplementary environmental impact statement, which was done. And there have been comments on that. The number I heard today was about 2.5 million public comments. Now, those the State Department and 8 other federal government agencies are looking at those comments. There was, of course, also the Nebraska court case. And so when the Nebraska court case came along, the State Department gave the 8 federal agencies additional time to work on their responses. There is, and at some point, the State Department will give them guidance on a deadline for when those inputs have to be submitted, but that hasn't been decided yet, what that is. And then once the agency's inputs are received, then there is the national interest determination that Secretary Kerry has to make, and there is not a deadline for that. So that's consistent with the executive order under which the review is being carried out. Then up until now, the secretary has not been involved in kind of a hands-on way in this review, but of course, as we move forward with the national toward completing the national interest determination, of course he'll get more into the details.
Is there just a quick follow-up? Is there a scenario under which this decision isn't going to get made before the end of 2016?
I have no comment on a deadline for conclusion of the national interest determination. There's not a deadline for it in the executive order. So I don't mean to imply that that we intend to take all that time. I'm also not trying to imply that it's going to be rushed. I'm just saying there is no deadline. So I wouldn't speculate about exactly when the national interest determination would be submitted. Yeah, go ahead, and we'll come to you.
Curious process-wise.
I'm sorry, I can't. Mark.
Sorry.
Okay, Mark. Okay.
I'm just kind of curious process-wise. I mean, there's the president's daily briefing. There's your daily briefing in the mornings.
Right.
But when you have like a breaking kind of event that's taking place, and there's policy issues that are sort of taking shape.
Right.
You know, with clearly White House involvement and sometimes maybe Pentagon involvement, or just,
Right.
you know, there's plenty of people that have to weigh in, but you've got your daily morning meeting with the reporters the next day. What's just like how does the clock work like on that? Like who do you know, how is the interaction working typically? I know there's no typical, but before you're ready to go out there and say, sort of, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Or this is our position on something. How many checkoffs of people weighing in on a regular, you know, major policy initiative would there be?
Right. So the White House briefing is often 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. The state briefing is usually at 1. So sometimes they're happening simultaneously. That was the case today, which of course, you know, opens up all sorts of opportunities for someone to say, well, I see that the White House just said X, and then you're confronted with having to, say something that is, yes, of course that's true, but you can't be monitoring that in real time. So sometimes they happen simultaneously. Often the Pentagon's briefings will be a little bit earlier in the morning. I don't know if that's because they wake up earlier and start work earlier, or what that is attributable to. But anyway, by about midday, we will have worked through things that we think are likely to be raised and what we want to say about them. And that's a process that starts in the morning, before the official opening of business. We've come up with, what we think is a rough guess at things that were likely to be asked that day. We inform the people who have the expertise, ask them to provide input so that we can accurately reflect views, and that also includes coordinating with, in many cases, the National Security Council or the Pentagon, or in some cases the Department of Justice, whichever other foreign affairs agency might have some equity in that. So that's kind of the normal process. When you have something that happens 45 minutes before the briefing starts, then sometimes it's kind of a hectic rush to consult with people in other parts of Washington. And sometimes it means you simply can't say very much. Say, well, this just happened, we're reviewing, we'll come back to you when we have more. But more often it's that you just rush to compress that several-hour process of deliberation into a few minutes where you make sure you're all more or less on the same page. Yes?
Procedurally, what is the next step in the U.S.-Cuba deal in terms of opening up the embassy, if that's going to happen, appointing an ambassador? I'm not assuming all of this is going to happen. I'm just trying to get a sense of the framework for the relations to move forward.
Sure. Well, that's certainly one of the goals, and as the president announced in his speech on December 17th, that he has decided to begin the process of normalizing relations with Cuba, which would include opening an embassy. I think it's important to highlight, though, that we already have a diplomatic representation in Cuba, as the Cubans do in Washington. We each have our own interest sections. So this would be, in some ways, more an upgrading of those diplomatic representations to embassy status. But that's only one of several parts. I would say there are a couple of things that are going to happen very soon. For example, we will have first high-level direct government-to-government contacts on normalization next week. So the Assistant Secretary who does Latin America issues, Roberta Jacobson, she is going to Havana next week. She will have, on the one hand, a day of talks on migration issues. These are talks that we regularly have. This framework has been in place for quite a few years. And then she will also have a day of talks with the Cuban counterparts on normalization issues. So naturally, there are lots of policy issues, lots of technical issues that come into that. But that will be a first opportunity to kind of sit down and map out where those are. We don't have a deadline on when an embassy will open, when an ambassador would be nominated and confirmed. Those are all things that will be, that will take the pace of the normalization talks. There are other things that the president spoke about in his December 17th speech, such as the changes to the regulations that will come from the Departments of Treasury and Commerce, and they're working on those. There's not a specific deadline for those to be issued, but I think at the time, and that was about 4 weeks ago. The characterization was that it would be weeks, not months. So our colleagues in those agencies are working on those regulatory revisions, and as soon as they're ready, then those will be published, and then that is what drives all of the changes to licensing, for example, and so naturally those are quite important. In addition to the regulatory steps, the release of the political prisoners is just one example of the kinds of issues that, frankly, we've not been able to talk directly to Cuba about over the years because we didn't have diplomatic relations. And so we will continue to talk about human rights issues with Cuba, and having normalized or normalizing relations will provide an opportunity to try to advance those interests as well. Now, over the years, there have been other areas where we have had contacts. Migration issues was the one that I mentioned earlier. Also, things that have to do with some maritime issues and air traffic issues. So there have been some of those, I would say, less political, more technical contacts, and the normalization of relations then allows us to turn that into a much fuller, broader engagement, not only with the Cuban government, but with the Cuban people, because that's really essential
As you
to it.
probably know, there were really, really strong rumors this week about Fidel Castro and his health. I mean, to the point
Yeah.
that the AP had our whole backup plan was fully set up.
And
How do you-
there was a day where they thought a news conference had been announced in Havana, and then it wasn't, and there
we
was.
sent our whole crew to Havana. We're like on standby, and it was really the guy seems
Yeah.
to be alive. My question is, how do you deal with those rumors when they get that strong to the point that the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal, serious news organizations are, preparing their action plans? Like, how do you deal with those rumors at the State Department? Do you even, in terms of confirming, denying? I mean, what?
Sure. Well, in general, we're not in the business of confirming things that happen, that are in the purview of other governments. So, in that particular instance that you referred to, that's not one where we would be confirming anything. But of course, it's our business, it's our responsibility to be prepared for eventualities. So naturally, we pay attention to this very carefully too, from a slightly different perspective than the news organizations. But it's a similar kind of interest. Our interest is to make sure that if something happens, then can we understand internally how can we confirm for ourselves if something has or hasn't happened, and then what's the appropriate U.S. response. So. I don't know if you guys were more spun up about it. Perhaps so. But we have to deal with all sorts of rumors and things that are unconfirmed, and we sometimes are. We are generally cautious about those kinds of things, because if we make a false step, people will notice it and remember. Of course, the same applies to you guys too. But I think for us, we're always very mindful of the fact that folks like yourselves can come back to us and say, "Well, hey, wait a minute, you got that wrong." So, not wanting to get things wrong is also a large part of the consideration for us. We'll come to you in a second, but we'll take your colleagues at the end, whom we haven't heard from yet.
Dustin, National Journal.
You're not Amber Phillips, then.
No.
That's the only name I can see from here. Okay.
What's the deal with North Korea?
That's an open-ended question.
See, it didn't work.
You expected me to.
Earlier today, a very seasoned reporter suggested that was the best way to ask a question.
Can you narrow that down for me a little?
Well, you just interpret it the way you want to interpret it.
Well,
When can
do
we
you have any-
expect any next steps? The government has continued to say they're not done. with the response to the Sony hack. Are we going to expect to see anything from the State Department along these lines?
Is that what you wanted to
That,
ask?
and then I have a follow-up, but I would like to hear that answer as well.
Right. Well, I think with respect to the response to the hack, there are some steps that have already been taken. There was an executive order released about 10 days ago, and and I think to go back to the way the president characterized it, is the United States will have a proportionate response. I think the way he described it was, there are some things you'll see and some things you won't see. So it won't come as a surprise to you that I'm not going to make predictions about actions that we may take in the future. But clearly this is activity that is deeply concerning for the United States, and therefore we think it's important to respond. Now that's I know that's not too specific, but again, we're not going to get in the business of telegraphing what our responses might be, because that can mitigate their impact. And yeah, so that I think is what I would say with about the question of response. I mean, there are a whole bunch of other North Korea related issues, of course. I mean, you probably saw over the weekend that the North Koreans made a sort of what they characterized as an offer, which to us looked more like a threat. The offer was that they would not carry out another nuclear test if the United States and South Korea called off the annual military exercises that we've been doing more or less for 40 years. And so we see that as a threat, because North Korea has carried out a few nuclear tests already. They've been condemned and by the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has imposed sanctions on North Korea for that activity. They are under a requirement, an international legal requirement, to cease their nuclear activities, among other things. And so to try to trade that for something that's quite different and defensive in nature is to us a non-starter. So that's we continue to have lots of concerns about North Korea's activity as it relates to the security of Northeast Asia and proliferation, and it's not just the hack against Sony that has made North Korea one of the most sanctioned countries on Earth. It's their nuclear activity, it's their ballistic missile activity, it's a whole range of particularly troubling endeavors that they've undertaken. Yes.
I just had one.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of the conviction that North Korea is indeed behind the attack, I'm sure you're aware that a number of security experts have come out to suggest that they have some doubts about that. Last week we saw some senior level administration officials kind of reveal a little bit more about what they know, but can we expect to learn more maybe about the process of identifying North Korea here? And was there an effort, can you comment at all on any efforts to give information to reporters prior to the official announcement that it was North Korea? There has been some sort of pushbacks to some of the early media reports which said senior level officials, can't name them, said it's North Korea, and some of those reports have since sort of been, again, criticized.
I'm guessing in this case, these were probably not from the State Department, because we are not in the lead on cyber issues. So, I don't think I have a whole lot to offer on the last part of your question. Now, about the attribution, I think the difficult situation that we, by which I mean the United States government, not just the State Department, find ourselves in is, much of the information we have is obtained through means that we can't publicly describe, and so this is always. I'm sure you've experienced this on many issues where you've worked on stories with people in the federal government. Is there are limits to how much we are willing to say about certain things. That doesn't mean that's the whole universe of our information. We went through this as well last summer after the shooting down of MH17. There were the U.S. intelligence community released a number of images and other conclusions that were based on intelligence information. That source material is not something we can make public unless we want to ensure that we'll never have information from whatever those sources or methods are again. So we constantly face this difficult choice between how much can we say in order to give the right kind, convey that we are sure of the conclusions we've reached, while still preserving our ability to reach further conclusions on that or related matters in the future. Now, on the FBI's conclusion about the responsibility for the hack on Sony, they, in their initial statement and then in subsequent statements, I think they've also clarified that there is information on the one hand which conveys clearly to the U.S. government and our intelligence community. It wasn't just the FBI that reached the conclusion. It was done on the basis of work across the U.S. government, that North Korea was responsible. There have been, as you pointed out, some further statements by people in the sort of cybersecurity and from private cybersecurity companies, suggesting that, well, there might be this person or this organization who also had some role. I think our sense is that those aren't necessarily contradictory statements, and so our conclusion about North Korea's responsibility for that activity remains. That doesn't mean, however, that you couldn't have had some others outside North Korea who played some role in it, but it doesn't change our conclusion about responsibility. On that, follow on that topic. Okay, because we've also got your colleague.
I was going to change gears.
Okay, so if you have something on that topic.
Here's a question, and this is maybe beneficial to the whole room as well. Like, I actually have something just in listening to you chat about this that I'd like to talk to you about, maybe outside of this group.
Mm-hmm.
So, do I go to, PA media requests at state government, or how do I, touch base with you? Like, what's the best way to?
Yeah. So, I think if you're topic ABC, you get in touch with the Public Affairs Bureau if there is, and then tell us what you're interested in, what topic you're interested in. If there's somebody in particular you want to talk to, we'll get in touch with them and see if we can make it happen. Again, that's not a guarantee we can in every case, but that's that would be the way to do it. Now, if you happen to know somebody in the Bureau that is responsible for the particular issue,
but the best way to go, basically, other than, you and I go back at least 40 minutes now.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
his email is right on here.
Yeah, 50 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
50. Yeah.
Well, see, you're very precise.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we're not trying to stop journalists from talking to U.S. government officials. But again, to come back to the point I made earlier, we want to be sure that that the State Department and as other cabinet agencies do, that we not confuse matters by having one person who may know one segment of an issue talk about it, somebody else who knows another segment of an issue, they talk about it, and you can wind up with kind of a message that or a presentation of it that doesn't reflect the full the issue in its completeness. That's, I guess, the way I would put it. Go ahead.
So I think it was a couple months ago, Jen Psaki and Admiral Kirby from the Pentagon did their first
Yes.
joint presser. I was just curious because I'm a defense reporter. I don't watch the state pressers as much as I do the Pentagon's. But
what was the impetus for that, and is that something that we're likely to see more of? And what's the level of coordination of the press operations between the two departments, given that there's oftentimes a military element to something, but also a diplomatic, like in Afghanistan or in Iraq or something?
Right. So on the joint briefing they did, I know there was some speculation about whether that was whether there was some deeper purpose behind it. I think it was just a reflection of the fact that, as you say, there are a lot of issues that have a lot of national security issues, a lot of foreign policy issues that have both a diplomatic and a security component. And so you will often, on the same day when Jen Psaki may be speaking from our podium about the fight against ISIL, you'll have John Kirby getting questions on that topic, but probably from a different angle. So it was the joint briefing came up as an attempt to try something a little bit new, which is to bring those two organizations together. I think they'll probably do it again. I don't know if there's a specific schedule for doing it. A lot of it just depends on travel schedules and so forth. But it's an attempt to address and recognize the fundamental issue that you highlighted, and the way we try to do that on a day-to-day basis is by sharing our views and our how we plan to address queries with our colleagues at the Pentagon and with the National Security Council in most cases. Those are the three parts of the U.S. government that on most things are going to be connected in one way or another. And again, for some other issues, it may be a different federal agency, DHS sometimes, Department of Justice, FBI. But we try to start early in the morning by coordinating, how we look at it. We try not to get too far out of our lane. If somebody asks us, in fact, when I was briefing a couple of weeks ago, I got lots of questions about the train and equip program in Syria, or not in Syria, for the Syrian opposition. And some of that we can speak to, of course, from the State Department. When do we think it's going to get underway? But as far as how it will be implemented, how many trainers, how many people are they going to train, and so forth, that is a Defense Department program. So we refer things back there. We try not to do too much referring if we can help it, because I'm sure that you don't like to be bounced from one organization to another. On the other hand, we also have to respect the fact that at a certain point, things get beyond our ability to comment comprehensively on them, and we need to have the people who are the stakeholders respond. Go ahead.
I'm wondering what your take is on the decline in foreign coverage from legacy papers here in the States.
You care to name any?
How that affects the way that both, we as Americans understand what's happening internationally, and also how that affects, the State Department's messaging. As you said, at the beginning, the press does that for you to a large degree.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to think of much to say. I mean, of course, we think that the more we are glad that we have opportunities and interest in foreign affairs issues. That's what we do at the State Department. So having a greater sources of information for the American public, and also for, as you mentioned, the major news organizations often wind up setting the framework and the agenda for others. So it's an important function. I'm not going to comment on their business decisions, I guess. And I think what we also see is that if perhaps there is a decline in that overseas presence, what I notice is, even on an almost month-to-month basis, an increase in the number of well-informed specialist organizations that stake out expertise in a particular in a particular niche area. I mean, by saying niche, I don't mean to trivialize
What do
it.
you mean by specialist organizations? News organizations, or?
Yeah. I mean, there are, so I don't want to say that replaces the changes in large organizations' overseas presence, but it's certainly something noticeable. You know, we have a lot of people, whether they're writing solely online, a lot of them writing solely online, but we have a lot of people who have let's say arms control, for example. I've seen a lot greater profile from many of those writers, as we've talked about chemical weapons in Syria, as we've talked about allegations of activity in North Korea, and so forth. Again, I don't know if that compensates for, but you know it's a change. There are multiple changes happening out there.
Well, so for example, with the latest Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that Secretary Kerry led, he made a big point of saying, you know, this is only going to work if the negotiations aren't leaked to the press, and did a unusually good job of ensuring that. Would the coverage have changed? You know, do you think years ago if there were more reporters who were traveling with state, or just more newspapers with robust Middle East bureaus who were looking at that issue, would it have been harder for the department to have, maintained that insularity when you were negotiating?
I don't know. I think you've probably heard the secretary talk not only in the context of those efforts, but also when he's been asked, frequently about one report or another about a particular detail of what somebody thinks was discussed with Iran in the nuclear talks. I think what you've heard from him is the strong conviction that a successful negotiation process, it can't be completely hidden from public view, but it requires the ability to have discussions that stay within the room where they're held. Now, I would hazard to guess that from the State Department's point of view, we probably would not agree with the suggestion that somehow there's less transparency or less information that enterprising journalists come up with about ongoing foreign policy processes and issues than in the past. I think it probably looks more the opposite from our perspective. So I think we might have a different view on the question, but it's certainly it's certainly something that's important to us. If you think about the policy change with respect to Cuba, another process that was carried out
in secret.
Yeah.
I'm
And
not suggesting
is
that the State Department now is somehow less transparent than the State Department under previous administrations. I'm just wondering whether or not the fact that there are fewer, journalists in the Middle East from larger legacy news institutions in the U.S., for example, if that changes the way that we're able to cover you. Or in the case of Cuba, which is a bombshell to basically everybody in huge news when it happened, and a secret before it happened, would it have been harder to pull that off, 20 years ago?
It's an interesting question. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I have got a great answer for that. I'm not sure. Why don't you go ahead? We'll kind of come down the row here. So, no, please, Alvina, you first, then to Tal.
I'm going to go back to North Korea.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw a totally wide, open-ended question.
Great, I love those.
What challenges lie ahead?
Well, the fundamental challenge is the same one that we've identified for years. North Korea and its nuclear and missile programs represent a danger for international peace and security. That's why you have all of North Korea's neighbors, along with the United States and the UN Security Council, that have consistently called on North Korea to renounce its nuclear activities and to rejoin talks without any preconditions. And that's been the case since the joint declaration, if I'm not mistaken, 2005, and even before that. So it's a question of, so we see from time to time, like we were talking about earlier with respect to Dustin's question, you see a proposal that comes from the DPRK that doesn't really address that issue, and that's the fundamental issue. That's what the six-party talks are about. That's the thing that is getting in the way of improved inter-Korean relations. That's the thing that has led to North Korea's increasing international isolation. So I can't predict the future, but I do know what the focus is from the U.S. Perspective, and it's that North Korea needs to address.
What about in terms of U.S. strategy to, I guess for lack of a better word, tame North Korea? Tame? Can we use that word?
Well, are you asking what our strategy is with toward North Korea?
What are the challenges in trying to cope? Obviously, U.S. has tried, and North Korea doesn't take instructions from anyone. How do you regroup? What do we do? What are we going to do differently?
Well, I'm not going to predict that we're going to change our approach. It's true that North Korea still represents a huge destabilizing problem for Northeast Asia, and but if you look at the perspectives of the other countries in the six-party talks, in particular, if you look at China's point of view, I think you see that the countries in the six-party talks process remain focused on denuclearization as the key issue. So I don't think we would accept the notion that we in the United States or the other countries in the six-party talks need to change our strategy. It is North Korea, sadly, that is that bears the brunt of the whether it's sanctions or it's international isolation. But again, those are within the DPRK's ability to address. Tal?
Is Dennis Rodman involved in?
No. Sorry to disappoint.
I thought he was a cyber expert, right? I'm curious, we heard from some White House reporters earlier today about, from their perspective, how every administration is different in terms of access and approach to handling the media. Do you think that there's a difference between administrations and secretaries in the way that the State Department approaches its relationship with the media?
I don't know. As I started off by saying, I'm not somebody who has done media work, press work for decades. So I don't consider myself terribly well suited to offer a judgment. I've spent the last 8 years overseas. I was in Malaysia for 3 years. I was in Brussels working on the NATO international staff for a couple of years. Before that, I was in Berlin for 3 years. In all those cases, doing work that focused on multilateral security, on bilateral relationships, not on dealing with the media, and also not working here in Washington for directly with secretaries of state. So I wouldn't reject such a characterization, but I also don't really feel like I'm in a position to affirm it.
What about from your perspective, when you had a new secretary come in or a new administration come in while you were in the field, so to speak? Did that affect you at all?
Well, of course, every secretary brings his or her own, policy priorities. Those, of course, are coordinated with and led by the president ultimately. But sure, each secretary has his or her own way of doing things, and certain issues that will be important, perhaps personally, but more likely just because of events at the time. So, I think that's about as far as I could go on that one. I think Mark had one, and we'll come back around.
I'm going to try to shoehorn two in here.
Yes.
So how involved are you and your staff?
That's cheap. I think most of the people who cover the State Department, when they get a question at the Secretary's press avail, it's usually at least 3 questions.
Well, I'm pretty low on the total poll, so that's why it's So how involved are you and your staff in deciding what public appearances the Secretary makes, or whether he's going to take a question, or whether there's going to be a news conference? So for example, the White House today said that they should have sent somebody higher to Paris for the march. I think the State Department said either this morning or last night or something that Secretary Kerry had his travels,
Right.
And that he was committed. But this Secretary has turned on a dime before to go to world hotspots when he's deemed it necessary. So I'm curious, is your office, are you folks involved with saying, hey, we really need to go here, or let's say how this is going to look?
I would say my office is more involved on the, we're not the ones who make decisions about or give advice about where the Secretary should travel. That's, those are things that are handled by, his sort of inner staff in consultation with other agencies in Washington as appropriate, but usually in conjunction with like the sort of the senior officials who are responsible for a particular issue. No, nobody asked me. That wasn't my.
My second question
decision.
is Mike McCurry and a bunch of White House former and State Department former
Yes.
press secretaries held an event in the National Archives a couple months ago. It was fascinating. Anyways, Mike McCurry said that one of his challenges when he was press secretary was to convince
At the White House or at the State Department?
I think he was talking about both, actually.
Okay.
And he was saying one of his challenges is when a topic of the day comes up, and he's talking to those subject matter experts that you were talking about,
Yeah.
you go to in the morning, he goes trying to convince some of them that I'm walking out on that podium at 1 o'clock, and whether you come up with an answer for me or not, I have to say something. So I need it by then. And that he was saying that one of the challenges is in some parts of the government that it was very tough for him to rattle the cage enough to get an answer in time. That sometimes he had to convince people, I'm going to come up with U.S. policy if you don't give me something better, because I got to walk out on that podium. Do you find that there was...
I could imagine he was able to say that in a much more colorful way than I could.
Yes, well, because he was former, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, have you had to convince people in the government, hey, I'm walking out on that stage, or Jen, or Maria, or somebody is, and we need an answer on this, even if it's a compressed timeline, because news is breaking?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, not always, but there's often this, inherent tension between wanting to be able to respond quickly to something that's happening that is important, and also, wanting to be sure you've gotten it right. So, yeah, that happens a lot. Not always to the degree that you described in that anecdote, but certainly, yeah, we face that a lot, and it's I would say most of the time, of course, one person or another, might just not want to say, anything to be said on the record. I mean, if I could say from my experience as a policy officer, most of the time you really, you'd be happy if you could just do your work and not have to, answer all of these, unruly questions from outside. And what I appreciate now more than I ever have is that you simply can't avoid addressing questions. Now, maybe you can't address them comprehensively in all cases, and you're not able to satisfy the audience, but you can't simply say, "Oh, I'm not going to talk about that" most of the time. So I think that's certainly true, and we do our best to get. I would say also, though, that I think that many of our senior officials appreciate this extremely well too. I mean, our Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs is Victoria Nuland, who was herself spokesperson for the State Department for several years. So I think everyone understands the importance of being able to communicate effectively and quickly. The real tension is when you don't feel you've got adequate information to make. To reach a conclusion, how do you handle those kinds of situations? Because as we talked about a little bit earlier, if you get something wrong, somebody's going to come back and ask you about it, and it's not just for wanting to be defensive. It's wanting not to give the impression that our point of view changes, with on a day-to-day basis. You want to be sure that when you say something that is attributable to the Department of State, that everything has been taken into consideration. You're not going to have to shift later. Please.
So I have two questions. On a personal level, what are your favorite sources of foreign coverage for, news sources that you read for foreign analysis, news coverage, not for your job, but what you read on your own time,
Okay.
your go-to,
All
2 to
right.
3. And then what is the process for developing the travel alerts for, issuing them? And do you think that they're of any use? Or if at this point people are just like this weekend you issued one because of the Paris attacks, and is there any value to them at this point?
Well, you tell me. What do you think on that one?
Gosh, I feel like so many of them are put out that I can't tell the difference between why one was put out after the Paris attacks but not put out because of an incident in another country.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what your judgment process is for deciding this is a big enough event that we're going to put one out versus we're not going to put one out for this
Mm-hmm.
event.
Well, the travel warning that was issued, the travel warning that was issued on Friday. In that, of course, the most recent event that had happened was were the attacks in Paris. Although that warning itself was actually quite long and comprehensive. Now, I think what you're saying is maybe they're so comprehensive as to be, difficult for people to digest. The problem for us, though, is, what if you haven't warned people? And I think there was a point, on Friday, taking into consideration not just the attacks in Paris, but also in Australia, in Canada. There have been a number of incidents that we felt was important to remind people once again that, not to say that you shouldn't travel, but if you travel, there are things you should take into consideration. And so I think in that regard, we would probably rather, we would, if we have to make an error on one side or another of the line, should we issue this particular travel warning or travel alert or whatever it happens to be in a particular circumstance, or not? You think we're always mindful of the that we don't want to be in a position where we have failed to share with the American public information that could be helpful for people staying safe when they're traveling. As far as things that I read, wait, repeat that part of the question again, because you asked kind of
Because not for your job, but on a
Okay.
personal, like what you read for
so
yourself.
anything. Okay.
What you prefer to read,
So
not because of your job.
well, I get so many articles sent my way because we follow in one of the things that my office does is we follow reporting that comes from pretty much almost all of your organizations, and so people will email those around. So I find that I have hundreds and hundreds of articles that come through my email inbox. So I think on that basis, I probably cover the major publications. So what I tend to look for in my personal time is something that's a bit longer, that is perhaps a bit more analytical. But the other thing that I do, and I think a lot of my Foreign Service colleagues do the same thing, is you often spend time overseas acquiring language expertise, and you want to keep that and not lose it. So I've spent a lot of time in Germany, so I tend to read German publications, in part just to know how some place outside the United States is looking at something, but also to keep up the reading skills. Also, I spent time in Russia, so I will read Russian things in Russian from time to time. So those, I think, the combination of getting a perspective from something that's not written for an American market is often helpful, even if it doesn't change what you might do in a specific circumstance. It reminds you that this is a world where you've got lots and lots of news organizations out there and lots of different perspectives.
What do you think about the RT network?
I was just going to say that.
So, which is Russia's network basically operating?
Is that your favorite go-to channel?
No, I wouldn't. But it's not necessarily on my top 10 list. Look, we think it's great if there are free if there are free media organizations, by which I mean free, unconstrained, not not no cost, that are able to report on issues that people care about. I don't think that's necessarily the approach that RT always takes. So,
can they come into the briefings?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What percentage is foreign of press in those briefings, roughly?
Well, the people who are actually sitting there, I'd say, you've got the wires there, you've got the networks generally, and then we have, we have quite a few Asian outlets. We have a couple of Turkish, sometimes Greek outlets that come, some Middle Eastern broadcasters. So maybe it's 50-50. I don't know. But then there are also a lot of people who watch the press briefing in the live stream version. So we notice certainly there are a lot of people who will basically be live tweeting from the press briefing, but they're not there in the room. And so there I don't really have the numbers break down on where people are watching us from. That is, people who are using it for journalistic purposes rather than just
writing
for
Russian folk songs about Jen Psaki.
Exactly. Yes.
All right. Last question, Dustin.
Russia reminded me. Edward Snowden blames the State Department for him ending up in Russia, although he did recently say that he's enjoying his time there and his life is great. That's an issue that hasn't come up in a while in front of the State Department, White House. Anything to add there? What's the deal with Edward Snowden's status as under asylum in Russia?
What's the deal with X? So, I wish I had in front of me sort of the timeline and all of that stuff. I just don't, because as you say, it hasn't come up lately, so it hasn't been fresh in my mind. The idea that he might have come back to the United States, that he wasn't intended to go somewhere else and stay outside the United States. Our point of view on his situation is that he should face responsibility for what he's done. Whether he's enjoying life in Russia or not, I don't really have a comment on that. But anyway, any suggestion that somehow we, the State Department, are responsible for his having wound up where he is
You did revoke his
passport.
passport.
Though, right?
Sure.
And he's stuck in Russia.
Well, no, but you can always come back to the United States, whether you've got a valid passport or not, if you're a U.S. citizen. So that's I think that's a separate question.
All right. And on that note,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to offer you a mug.
Okay.
This is from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios.
All right.
Next door.
Thank you.
And you can take that with you as a memento of your really enjoyable time here.
Thank you very much.
On the hot seat.
Yes.